The war had come at last. Everyone in the galaxy knew it was only a matter of time before the Drakful Dominion made its move. And now that day had arrived with fire and fury, and the screaming of billions across the Korath system. The Drakful were insectoid monsters, standing 8 feet tall with armored exoskeletons the color of dried blood and mandibles that could shear through steel plating like paper. And they did not negotiate, they did not trade, and they did not show mercy because mercy was a concept their species had never evolved to understand. They had besieged the Korath system with a fleet of 9,000 warships and deployed over 20 million ground soldiers onto the 4 habitable worlds within it. And if Korath fell then, the inner rim of the galaxy would be exposed, and every civilization within 300 light years would face annihilation. So the Galactic Coalition acted. The Coalition was an alliance of 42 spacefaring civilizations that had banded together over the centuries for mutual protection and trade, and it was governed by a high command of generals and admirals from the 12 most powerful species. And they met aboard the colossal space station, known as the Throne of Starlight, which orbited the neutral world of Verath Prime like a metal moon covered in weapons. The Coalition High Command issued a formal call to arms, and every member species was required to send their finest military forces to the war summit where strategy would be planned, and armies would be assembled for the largest military operation in galactic history. And so they came. The Ormka arrived first because the Ormka always arrived first for war, and they were massive creatures standing 12 feet tall with 4 arms and skin like granite, and they had been bred for combat across 10,000 years of genetic selection. And their general was a terrifying figure named Tharnok, who had personally killed over 600 enemies in hand-to-hand combat, and wore their teeth on a necklace around his thick neck. The Velunari came next in their elegant phase-cloaked destroyers that shimmered in and out of visible light like ghosts made of silver, and their supreme commander Velis was a tall and slender being with luminous pale skin, and eyes that saw in spectrums no other species could perceive, and the Velunari were known as the finest naval tacticians in the galaxy. The Therlians sent their ancient Archon Selûne, who was over 900 years old, and had commanded fleets before most of the species in the Coalition had even discovered fire, and he was the appointed leader of the entire Coalition military by virtue of his experience and wisdom, and the fact that no one wanted to argue with someone who remembered the last 3 galactic wars firsthand. The Kethri brought their acid-spitting shock troops, and the Dremori brought their psychic warfare battalions who could shatter an enemy's mind from half a kilometer away, and the Juvari brought their living bioships that healed themselves during battle, and species after species arrived with armies and fleets and weapons that could crack moons in half. The Grand War Chamber filled with the sound of boots and claws and hooves on metal floors, and holographic displays lit up showing troop counts and fleet compositions and weapons capabilities, and every species tried to outdo the others, because this was not just a war summit but a display of power and prestige. The Ormka pledged 15,000 biotitans, each one a genetically enhanced super soldier capable of fighting for 72 hours without rest. The Velunari unveiled an armada of 300 phase-cloaked destroyers, supported by 48 carrier ships, each containing 5,000 fighter drones. The Kethri presented their elite Venom Guard, numbering 10,000 strong and armed with weapons that dissolved organic matter on contact. The numbers were staggering, and the chamber buzzed with energy and confidence, because surely with all this combined, might the Drakful would be crushed. But there was one species that had not yet presented. Humanity, the youngest member of the Coalition, admitted only 30 standard years ago after making first contact with a Velunari survey ship near the edge of the Orion Arm, and in those 30 years, humanity had done nothing particularly impressive by galactic standards. Humans were small, averaging about 6 feet tall, which made them shorter than almost every other Coalition species, and they were soft with no natural armor or claws or venom or psychic abilities, and they lived for barely a century, which was considered tragically brief by species that routinely lived for 500 years or more. They had been admitted to the coalition mostly as a political gesture, because the Therians believed in inclusivity, and Archon Selon had argued that even lesser species deserved representation, and so humanity had been given a seat at the table, though most species considered them little more than a curiosity. A clever species of primates from a mid-sized death world, interesting to study, but certainly not to be taken seriously in matters of war. When the human delegation was announced, the chamber quieted slightly, and several generals exchanged amused glances, because everyone was curious what the humans would bring to this grand display of military power. The massive doors at the far end of the war chamber opened, and nothing happened. There was no parade of soldiers, no holographic display of fleet strength, no thundering march of armored warriors, and no dramatic unveiling of superweapons. Instead, a single unmarked transport ship had docked at the station an hour earlier without fanfare or announcement, and from that ship had come a small delegation of exactly 3 people. 2 of them were diplomats. The third was a soldier. Director Lena Acaffer was a tall woman with dark skin and calm, intelligent eyes, and she served as humanity's ambassador to the coalition, and she walked into the war chamber with quiet confidence, flanked by her aide on one side and the soldier on the other. The soldier's name was Sergeant Major Jonah Mercer. He was not particularly tall or muscular or impressive by any physical standard that the aliens in the room would recognize, and he wore matte black tactical armor that had no decorations or markings except for a small patch on his shoulder that read UNSC Special Operations Group, and he carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and walked with the easy, relaxed stride of someone who was not trying to impress anyone. He had gray eyes and short-cropped dark hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from wood by someone who did not believe in smiling, and there were scars on his hands and neck that told stories he would never voluntarily share. Director Acaffer approached the central podium, and the entire chamber of alien generals and admirals and warlords stared at her, and at the single soldier standing quietly behind her. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds before it was broken by laughter. General was the first to laugh, a deep booming sound that echoed off the metal walls of the chamber, and he slammed all 4 of his massive fists on the table in front of him, and pointed at Jonah with a finger as thick as a human forearm. The Kethri delegates hissed with amusement, and the Dremori made a telepathic sound that translated roughly to pathetic, and even the normally composed Velunari allowed thin smiles to cross their luminous faces. Director Acaffer stood perfectly still and waited. Jonah Mercer stood behind her and said nothing, and his gray eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every face and every uniform and every weapon, with the quiet patience of someone cataloging information for later use. Archon Selun raised one ancient hand, and the chamber fell silent because, when a 900-year-old Therian raised his hand, you listened. He looked at Director Acaffer with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, and he asked in a voice like dry wind over stone, why humanity had sent only one soldier to a war that threatened the entire galaxy. Director Acaffer met his gaze without flinching, and said simply that humanity had sent what was required and nothing more. The chamber erupted again, but Archon Selun silenced them once more, and then he made a decision that everyone in the room understood was not a kindness. He assigned Sergeant Major Jonah Mercer to the forward reconnaissance mission on Koreth IV, the most heavily fortified Drakval hive world. A mission that every analyst in the coalition had classified as essentially a death sentence, requiring a minimum force of 50,000 soldiers just to establish a beachhead. He gave it to one man. Jonah Mercer stepped forward and asked a single question in a voice that was quiet and steady and completely unafraid. He asked what the rules of engagement were. Arkan Selun told him there were none. And for the first time since he had entered the chamber, the faintest trace of a smile crossed Jonah Mercer's scarred face. The War Council convened in full session the following morning, and the atmosphere inside the Grand War Chamber was electric, with the kind of energy that only comes when powerful beings gather to plan the destruction of other powerful beings. Generals and admirals from 12 species sat around the massive crescent-shaped command table, and behind them their aides and advisors filled the tiered observation galleries, and holographic tactical displays floated in the air showing real-time intelligence from the Koreth system, where the Drakful continued to dig deeper into the 4 besieged worlds like parasites burrowing into living flesh. But before the real planning began, there was one piece of entertainment the chamber wanted to enjoy: humanity's single soldier. Word had spread across the entire station overnight, and by morning every species knew the joke. And the joke was this: the humans had sent one man to fight a war that had assembled the largest military force in galactic history, and that man was currently sitting alone in a small quarters on Deck 14, eating something called scrambled eggs and reading tactical reports on a portable data pad, as if he were preparing for a routine training exercise rather than a suicide mission. General opened the session by standing to his full 12-foot height and addressing the chamber in a voice that shook the drinking glasses on the table. And he said that before they discussed strategy, he wanted to formally register his disgust at humanity's contribution to the war effort. He called it an insult. He said that the Ormka had sent 15,000 of their finest warriors, each one capable of tearing a Drakful soldier apart with bare hands, and that every other species had made similar sacrifices of blood and treasure, and that humanity had responded by sending a single soft-skinned primate with a bag. The chamber rumbled with agreement. Supreme Commander Velis rose next, and she was the opposite of Tharnak in every way: tall and thin, and elegant where he was massive and brutal. But her words cut just as deep, and she said that the Velunari had committed 300 warships to this campaign, and that each ship represented billions of credits and thousands of crew members willing to die for the coalition. And she asked with cold precision what exactly one human soldier was supposed to contribute to an operation of this scale. She used a Velunari word that translated roughly to token gesture, but carried a much more insulting connotation, suggesting that the giver was either too poor or too cowardly to offer anything of real value. The Kethri general hissed that humans should be expelled from the coalition entirely, and the Dremori delegate broadcast a psychic impression of contempt so strong that several nearby aides winced, and even the normally neutral Juvari delegate made a comment about how their bioships had more individual cells than humanity had sent soldiers. One by one they took their turns, and each insult was sharper than the last. Humanity was called weak. Humanity was called arrogant. Humanity was called a mistake that the coalition should have never made. And through it all, Director Lena Akafer sat in her chair with her hands folded on the table and her face as calm as still water. She did not argue, and she did not defend, and she did not explain. Jonah Mercer was not in the chamber because he had not been invited to the strategy session, and he was instead in the station's Tactical Intelligence Center, reviewing every piece of data the coalition had gathered on the Drakful hive structures on Koreth IV. And he had been doing this for 9 hours straight without a break, and the intelligence analysts who worked in that center had started watching him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, because no one had ever seen someone absorb information with that kind of focused intensity. He read reports on Drakful biology and memorized their circulatory patterns, and identified the 6 points on their exoskeleton where the armor was thinnest. And he studied their hive architecture and found the structural weak points that the coalition engineers had noted but dismissed as irrelevant because no small force could ever reach them. and he analyzed their communication systems, which were based on complex pheromone signals. And he asked the analysts question after question about the chemical composition of those pheromones, until they ran out of answers and had to call in a xenobiologist. The xenobiologist was a Velunari scientist named Reth who looked at Jonah with the same mild contempt most Velunari showed humans, but answered his questions because the questions were surprisingly good. And after 2 hours of conversation, Reth realized with growing discomfort that the human was not just learning about the Drakful, but was building a complete operational model of their behavior in his head, mapping triggers and responses and vulnerabilities with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before with many different species. Reth asked Jonah what he planned to do with this information. Jonah said he planned to use it. Back in the war chamber, the strategy session had moved past the entertainment of mocking humanity and into the serious business of planning the assault on the Koreth system. And the plan that emerged was exactly what Jonah would have predicted if anyone had asked him, which no one had. It was a massive frontal assault. The coalition would deploy its combined fleet of over 6,000 warships to establish orbital superiority, and then they would land ground forces on each of the 4 besieged worlds in waves of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they would push toward the Drakful hive fortresses through sheer overwhelming force. And the projected timeline was 6 to 8 months, with an estimated casualty count of 500,000 coalition soldiers. It was the kind of plan that every species in the room understood, because it was the kind of plan that every species in the room had been fighting with for millennia. Gather your strength, point it at the enemy, and push until something breaks. General loved it because it meant the Ormka would be at the front where they belonged, and Supreme Commander Velis approved because it gave her fleet a clear role, and everyone agreed because it was big and powerful and impressive, and that was how wars were supposed to be fought. No one asked Jonah for his opinion. Archon Selûne assigned the forward reconnaissance of Koreth IV's central hive fortress to Jonah as planned, and he did it with the quiet gravity of someone signing a death warrant. And several generals actually laughed when the assignment was formally recorded, because the central hive fortress was a nightmare structure, buried 3 kilometers underground and defended by an estimated 2 million Drakful warriors. And sending one man to scout it was not a reconnaissance mission, but an execution. Director Akafer accepted the assignment on Jonah's behalf and requested only one thing: that coalition surveillance drones be positioned to monitor and broadcast Jonah's operation back to the War Council in real time. Archon Selûne agreed because he saw no reason not to, and several generals openly said they looked forward to watching, because it would at least be amusing to see how long a single human lasted against the Drakful before being torn apart. The session ended, and the generals filed out talking loudly about fleet movements and troop deployments and the glory that awaited them. And Director Akafer walked alone through the corridors of the station until she reached the Tactical Intelligence Center, where she found Jonah still working. He had covered an entire wall with holographic projections of the hive fortress interior and marked it with hundreds of small colored indicators that only he understood. And he had a chemical formula written on a data pad that he had developed with the reluctant help of the Velunari xenobiologist. And he had a timeline sketched out in his head that he had not shared with anyone. Director Akafer asked him if he was ready. Jonah looked at her and said he would need 48 hours on the ground. She asked him what would happen after 48 hours. He said that after 48 hours, the hive fortress would not be a problem anymore. She studied his face for a long moment, looking for doubt or fear or bravado, and finding none of those things, finding instead only the flat, certain calm of a man who had done the math and was satisfied with the numbers. She told him that the entire coalition thought he was going to die. Jonah picked up his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder and said that the entire coalition was welcome to watch. Then he walked out of the intelligence center and headed for the hangar deck where his drop pod was waiting, and the Velunari scientist Reth watched him go and felt something cold move through his chest that he had never experienced before in his 300 years of life. It took him several minutes to identify the emotion. It was dread. The drop pod hit the surface of Koreth IV like a bullet fired from heaven and buried itself 6 feet into the charred earth before the impact dampeners brought it to a shuddering halt. And Jonah Mercer sat inside the cramped metal shell for exactly 3 seconds listening to the world outside before he popped the hatch and stepped onto the surface of what every coalition analyst had called the most dangerous planet in the galaxy. The air was hot and thick, with a chemical tang that burned the inside of his nostrils, and the sky was a bruised yellow-brown color choked with ash and smoke from the Drakvol's industrial hive processes, and the ground was a wasteland of cracked rock and hardened resin structures that stretched to the horizon like the skeleton of some impossibly large dead organism. He could hear them. Even from the surface, he could hear the clicking and scraping of millions of Drakvol moving through the tunnels beneath his feet, a sound like a river of knives flowing underground, and any sane creature from any species in the galaxy would have gotten back in the drop pod and launched itself into orbit at maximum speed. Jonah checked his weapons, adjusted his pack, and started walking toward the main entrance of the central hive fortress 3 kilometers to the east. 14,000 light-years away, aboard the throne of Starlight, the Coalition War Council watched. Archon Selun had authorized the surveillance feed to be displayed on the main tactical screen in the war chamber, and what had started as a morbid curiosity quickly became something else entirely, because the generals expected to watch a human die, and instead they watched something that none of them had a framework to understand. Jonah did not approach the hive fortress through the main entrance. He circled the perimeter for 4 hours in complete silence, moving from cover to cover, with a patience that unnerved the Ormka observers, because the Ormka did not do patience, and could not comprehend why any warrior would spend 4 hours studying a target when they could simply charge at it and start killing. But Jonah was not looking for a fight. He was looking for a seam. And he found one. A ventilation shaft on the northeast side of the fortress, where the resin structure had cracked during a seismic event and been improperly repaired by the Drakvol worker drones. And the crack was barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through, but that was exactly wide enough. And Jonah wedged himself into the gap and disappeared into the fortress like water seeping through a crack in a dam. Inside the hive it was dark and hot, and the walls were alive with bioluminescent fungal growths that cast everything in a sickly green light. And the tunnels were not built for humans, but for creatures with different body proportions, so Jonah had to crouch and crawl and twist through passages that would have been impossible for any of the larger coalition species to navigate. General watched the feed and said nothing, because he was beginning to realize that his 15,000 bio-titans could not have fit through that crack. The first Drakvol patrol found Jonah 7 hours into his infiltration. 3 warrior-class drones rounded a corner and came face to face with the human in the narrow tunnel. And what happened next took less than 2 seconds, and the coalition generals had to replay the footage 4 times to understand what they had seen. Jonah did not fight the way the Ormka fought with strength and rage, and he did not fight the way the Kethri fought with venom and speed, and he did not fight the way any species in the coalition fought, because every species in the coalition fought according to their biological advantages and their cultural traditions and their centuries of military doctrine. Jonah fought like a human. He fought dirty. He threw a handful of chemical powder into the lead drone's sensory pits, blinding it instantly. And in the same motion, he drove a short blade into the second drone's throat at the exact point where the exoskeleton was thinnest, which he had memorized from the intelligence reports. And as the third drone lunged at him, he sidestepped and used the dying second drone's body as a shield, and then killed the third with a single precise strike to the nerve cluster behind its primary mandible. 3 enemies dead in under 2 seconds, and Jonah did not even breathe hard. He dragged the bodies into a side passage and used a chemical compound from his kit to mask the death pheromones they released, because he knew from his research that Dracful detected their dead through chemical signals, and if those signals were neutralized, the hive would not know these drones were missing for hours. The Kethri general leaned forward in his seat, because the Kethri were chemical warfare specialists, and even they had not thought to weaponize the Dracvol's own pheromone communication system. But Jonah was just getting started. Over the next 12 hours, the surveillance feed showed a single human dismantle the internal operations of the most heavily defended fortress in the Koreth system piece by piece, with nothing but the contents of his duffel bag and an understanding of the enemy that bordered on intimate. He found the nutrient processing vats that fed the fortress's 2 million defenders and introduced a slow-acting biological agent that would not kill the Dracful, but would make them sluggish and confused within 24 hours. And he chose a slow-acting agent deliberately, because an immediate mass die-off would trigger an alarm response, but a gradual decline would be interpreted by the hive mind as a simple nutrient deficiency. He located the 3 hive commanders who controlled the fortress's military response, and he killed each one in a different way at 3-hour intervals, so that the pattern of deaths would not suggest a single infiltrator, but rather 3 separate incidents, and the hive mind spent precious hours investigating each death independently, instead of locking down the fortress. He mapped every critical structural support in the fortress's lower levels, and placed small shaped charges at 47 key points that he had calculated would cause a cascading collapse if detonated simultaneously. And he did this while moving through tunnels crawling with Dracful warriors who never saw him and never smelled him, because he had coated himself in a pheromone blend that identified him to their senses as a worker drone. Supreme Commander Velis stood up from her chair without realizing she had done so. She was watching a single alien creature move through an enemy fortress with 2 million defenders like a ghost, like a virus, like something that had no right to exist in a galaxy where wars were won by numbers and firepower, and she could not process what she was seeing because her entire civilization's understanding of warfare had no category for it. General had stopped laughing a long time ago. He was gripping the edge of the table with all 4 hands, and his granite-like skin had gone pale, which was something that only happened to Ormka when they experienced genuine fear. And he whispered a question to no one in particular. He asked what Jonah Mercer was. Director Okafor was standing at the back of the observation gallery, and she answered him in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the entire chamber. She said that Jonah was what happened when a species evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill it, where the weather could kill, where the animals could kill, where the plants could kill, where even the water could kill. And instead of becoming the strongest or the fastest or the most venomous, that species became the most adaptable and the most creative and the most relentless. She said that humans did not have claws, so they made knives. And they did not have armor, so they made walls. And they did not have venom, so they made poison. And they did not have telepathy, so they made radios. And every single limitation that nature had given them, they had turned into a motivation to invent something better. She said that Jonah Mercer was not special by human standards. She said there were millions more like him. The chamber was very quiet after that. On the surface of Koreth, IV 36 hours into his mission, Jonah reached the central core of the Hive Fortress, the deepest point where the Queen's chamber pulsed with bioluminescent light, and the walls themselves seemed to breathe. And he set down his nearly empty duffel bag and pulled out one final piece of equipment. It was a small black device no larger than his fist. He activated it and placed it on the ground, and a single green light began to pulse. It was not a bomb. It was not a weapon. It was a target designator. And 14,000 light-years away, aboard the throne of starlight, the tactical displays suddenly lit up with a new signal broadcasting from deep inside the most heavily fortified structure on Korath IV. A signal that was not a distress call and not a status report, but something far more dangerous. It was an invitation. The signal pulsed once every 3 seconds, a steady green heartbeat broadcasting from 3 kilometers beneath the surface of the most dangerous world in the Korath system, and every sensor on every ship in the Coalition fleet detected it simultaneously, and every tactical officer on every bridge turned to their commanding officer with the same confused expression. General was the first to demand an explanation, and he roared the question at Director HFY with enough volume to rattle the fixtures on the ceiling of the war chamber. And he wanted to know what the signal was and what it meant, and what the human had done. Director HFY looked at him with the calm patience of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, and she said 3 words. She said the signal was a target designator. The chamber erupted into chaos because every military officer in the room understood what a target designator meant. It meant that someone on the ground was painting a target for someone else to hit, and the question that every general and admiral immediately asked was the obvious one. Who was going to hit it? Archon Selun silenced the chamber with a gesture and turned his ancient eyes to Director HFY and asked her directly what humanity had done. And Director HFY told them the truth. She told them that Sergeant Major Jonah Mercer was never meant to fight the war alone, and she told them that he was never meant to conquer the fortress by himself, and she told them that he was what humanity called a forward operator, the tip of the spear, the single sharp point that goes in first and finds the weakness and marks the target so that the hammer blow that follows lands exactly where it needs to land. She told them that Jonah's mission had 3 objectives: infiltrate the fortress, destabilize its defenses from within, and activate the target designator when conditions were optimal. All 3 objectives were now complete. General asked what hammer blow she was referring to. Director HFY smiled. And then the long-range sensors screamed. Every tactical display in the war chamber lit up like a supernova as fold space ruptures tore open on the edge of the Korath system, and from those ruptures emerged the human 7th Expeditionary Fleet in perfect formation, and they had been waiting in dark space beyond the system's sensor range for 72 hours, silent and invisible, coiled like a spring. The fleet was not enormous by Coalition standards. The Velunari alone had committed more ships, but what the alien generals saw on their displays made several of them physically step back from the table, because the human fleet was not designed for the kind of war the Coalition fought. It was designed for something else entirely. There were no massive battleships meant to slug it out in broadside exchanges, and there were no carrier groups meant to overwhelm with fighter swarms, and there were no troop transports loaded with hundreds of thousands of ground soldiers meant to be thrown at the enemy in waves. Instead, the fleet was composed of fast surgical strike craft and electronic warfare vessels and precision orbital bombardment platforms and rapid deployment marine transports, each carrying small teams of soldiers who were equipped not for prolonged ground combat, but for fast targeted strikes on specific objectives. The entire fleet was a scalpel, and the Coalition had been planning to use a sledgehammer. Supreme Commander Velis stared at the tactical display, and her luminous eyes widened as she began to understand the geometry of what was happening, because the Velunari were the finest naval tacticians in the galaxy, and she could see the pattern emerging before anyone else in the room. The human fleet was not positioning itself for a general engagement. Every ship was moving to a precise predetermined location, based on the intelligence that Jonah Mercer had been transmitting back throughout his 36 hours inside the fortress. And each ship's targeting systems were already locked onto specific coordinates that corresponded to the structural weak points and defensive positions and communication nodes that Jonah had identified and mapped. The humans had not come to fight a battle. They had come to perform surgery. And then the assault began. The orbital bombardment platforms fired first, and their weapons were not the massive area-denial weapons that the Coalition used to flatten entire grid squares, but precision kinetic penetrators. Metal rods accelerated to a fraction of light speed that punched through the planet's surface like needles, and detonated at exact depths calculated to destroy specific targets deep underground. The first salvo took out the Hive Fortress's shield generators, and Jonah had marked their locations with sub-meter accuracy. The second salvo destroyed the underground tunnel network connecting the fortress to 3 nearby secondary hives, cutting off reinforcements, and Jonah had mapped those tunnels during his infiltration. The third salvo collapsed the nutrient distribution centers that Jonah had already poisoned, and 2 million Dracval warriors who were already sluggish and confused from the biological agent suddenly found themselves cut off from all food sources. Then the electronic warfare vessels activated, and they broadcast a massive burst of synthetic pheromone data on the exact frequencies that the Dracval used for hive communication. And the formula for these synthetic pheromones had been developed by Jonah in collaboration with the Velunari xenobiologist Reth, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The Dracval hive mind fractured. Warriors who had been coordinating as a single unified force suddenly received contradictory chemical orders telling them to attack and retreat and defend and scatter all at the same time. And the result was chaos on a scale that no military force could recover from. And broods turned on each other and defensive positions were abandoned, and the fortress's entire command structure collapsed in minutes. And then the Marines dropped. 12 rapid deployment transports punched through the atmosphere and released their teams directly into the fortress through the breaches created by the orbital strikes. And these were not ordinary soldiers by any species definition. These were human special operations forces trained in the same tradition as Jonah Mercer. And they moved through the shattered fortress with the same terrifying efficiency that the Coalition generals had watched one man demonstrate over the past 36 hours, except now there were 200 of them working in perfect coordination. General watched a 12-person human fire team clear a chamber that his tactical officers had estimated would require 500 Ormka biotitans to secure, and they did it in 11 minutes using a combination of explosives and chemical agents and coordinated small arms fire that was so precise and so efficient that the Ormka general felt something he had never felt in his entire career of warfare. He felt obsolete. The Dracval Central Hive Fortress on Koreth IV, a structure that the Coalition's best military analysts had estimated would take 6 months and 500,000 casualties to conquer using the approved battle plan, fell in 11 hours. 11 hours. The war chamber was silent in a way that it had never been silent before, not the comfortable silence of agreement or the tense silence of disagreement, but the profound silence of beings who had just watched their understanding of the universe change. Supreme Commander Velis was the first to act, and she did so quietly, turning to her senior aide and ordering in a whisper that every intelligence file the Velunari possessed on humanity be immediately pulled and reclassified at the highest possible threat level. And her aide looked at her with surprise, because the Velunari had classified humanity as a non-threat since first contact, and Velis told her aide that this classification had been the most dangerous mistake the Velunari had ever made. The Kethri general was reviewing the chemical warfare data that Jonah had developed and realizing with growing alarm that the human had created a more effective pheromone weapon in 36 hours with field equipment than the entire Kethri Chemical Warfare Division had managed to develop in 20 years of dedicated research. The Dremori delegate reached out telepathically to sense Jonah's mind on the surface below, and recoiled almost immediately, because what it found there was not the chaotic, fearful mind of a creature that had just survived an impossible mission, but a calm, organized mind that was already categorizing lessons learned and preparing for the next operation. Archon Selûne sat in his command chair and stared at the tactical display showing the fallen fortress and the green indicators marking human positions throughout its ruins. And he was 900 years old and had seen more wars than anyone alive, and he said something that made every general in the chamber go very still. He said that they had all assumed humanity sent one soldier because they had nothing else to offer. He said they had been wrong. He said that humanity sent one soldier because one soldier was all they needed to begin. The communications officer announced an incoming transmission from the surface of Koreth IV, and Archon Selûne authorized it, and Jonah Mercer's voice filled the war chamber, calm and steady, and utterly without drama. He said that Koreth IV was secure, and he was awaiting his next assignment. General looked down at his 4 massive hands, hands that had killed 600 enemies in personal combat, hands that he had always believed represented the pinnacle of what a warrior could be. And for the first time in his life, those hands felt inadequate. The Ormka general turned to Director Akeffer and asked her one question. He asked how many soldiers like Jonah Mercer humanity had. Director Akeffer told him the number. General sat down very slowly and did not speak again for the rest of the session. 3 days passed after the fall of Koreth IV, and in those 3 days the galaxy changed in ways that would take historians centuries to fully understand. The Grand War Chamber aboard the throne of Starlight was called into session once more, and the same generals who had filled the room with laughter and mockery now filed in with the quiet, careful steps of beings who had learned something terrible about the universe and were still trying to decide what it meant. The chairs were the same, and the table was the same, and the holographic displays still floated in the air showing fleet positions and troop movements across the Koreth system. But everything else was different because the beings sitting in those chairs were different, changed at some fundamental level by what they had witnessed. General arrived early, which was unusual because the Ormka general had always made a point of arriving last as a display of dominance. But dominance displays seemed childish to him now, and he took his seat without a word and sat with all 4 hands folded on the table like a student waiting for a lesson. Supreme Commander Velis arrived with twice as many aides as usual, and each aide carried data pads loaded with hastily compiled intelligence reports on human military history and doctrine and capabilities. And Velis had spent the last 3 days reading these reports, and each one had made her more afraid than the last because the more she learned about how humans waged war, the more she realized that Koreth IV had not been a special case or an anomaly, but a routine operation by human standards. The Kethri general had requested and received a detailed breakdown of the chemical compounds Jonah had used during his infiltration, and had shared them with his chemical warfare division. And the response from his scientists had been a single word that in the Kethri language meant something between brilliant and horrifying. Archon Selûne was the last to arrive, and he moved slowly not because of age, but because he was carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his body. And he took his seat at the head of the crescent table and looked out at the assembled generals and saw fear in faces that had never known fear before. But the session did not begin with a discussion of strategy or fleet movements or troop deployments. It began with an announcement. The Drakval Dominion had sent envoys. In the entire recorded history of the Drakval species, spanning over 4,000 years of interstellar warfare, they had never once sent envoys to anyone for any reason, because the Drakval did not negotiate, and did not surrender, and did not communicate with other species except through violence. And yet 3 Drakval diplomatic vessels had appeared at the edge of the Vareth system, under flags of truce, requesting a formal audience with the Coalition High Command. The chamber reacted with stunned disbelief, because this was not just unexpected but impossible by everything they knew about the Drakval, and Archon Selûne authorized the envoys to be brought aboard the station under heavy guard. The Drakvol ambassador was a towering creature even by their species standards, standing nearly 10 feet tall with an exoskeleton that was darker and thicker than a standard warrior's, indicating extreme age and high caste status. And it entered the war chamber flanked by 2 guards and surveyed the assembled generals with compound eyes that showed no emotion, because Drakvol did not have emotions in any way the coalition understood. It communicated through a translation device that converted its pheromone signals into spoken language, and its first words were a demand. It demanded to know what species had destroyed the central hive fortress on Korath IV. Archon Selûne told the ambassador that the operation had been conducted by humans. The Drakvol ambassador was still for a long moment, and then it asked a second question. It asked how many humans had been sent for the initial assault. There was a pause in the chamber as Archon Selûne considered his answer, and then he told the truth. He said 1. The Drakvol ambassador received this information and processed it, and then did something that no coalition xenobiologist had ever documented a Drakvol doing in any context. It took a step backward. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but every being in the chamber saw it and understood it, because the body language of retreat is universal across all species that have ever evolved in a competitive environment. And the most feared predatory species in the galaxy had just flinched at the mention of a single human. The ambassador then presented its terms for a ceasefire, and the terms were remarkably generous by any standard, offering to withdraw from 2 of the 4 Korath worlds immediately and negotiate the status of the remaining 2. But the terms contained one absolute non-negotiable condition. The Drakvol demanded a formal non-aggression pact with Earth. Not with the coalition, not with the combined military forces of 42 species, but specifically and exclusively with the small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the Orion Arm, where humanity made its home. General listened to this demand and felt a chill run through his granite skin, because the implications were staggering. The Drakvol were not afraid of the Coalition's 6,000 warships, or the Ormka's 15,000 biotitans, or the Velunari's phase-cloaked destroyers. They were afraid of one species that had sent 1 soldier. The ceasefire negotiations proceeded quickly because the Drakvol wanted them to proceed quickly, wanted to formalize the agreement and withdraw before humanity decided to send a second soldier. And within 6 hours, a preliminary agreement was signed that effectively ended the war in the Korath system. After the Drakvol envoys departed, the war chamber fell into a heavy silence, and it was Archon Selûne who finally spoke. He said that the coalition owed humanity an apology. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and ripples of discomfort spread across every face, because galactic powers did not apologize to species they had been mocking 3 days ago. But Archon Selûne was 900 years old and had no patience for pride that had been proven foolish. He said that every species in the coalition ranked military power according to the same metrics: size, strength, numbers, technology, fleet tonnage, and lifespan, and by every one of those metrics humanity was unremarkable, average at best and inferior at worst. And so every species had looked at humanity and seen nothing worth respecting. He said they had all been measuring the wrong things. He said that humanity possessed something that could not be measured on any chart or quantified in any database, a quality that emerged from the unique pressures of their evolution on a world that was actively trying to kill them at all times. And that quality was not strength or speed or endurance or intelligence, taken individually, but rather the terrifying combination of all of those things fused together with creativity and adaptability, and a stubbornness that bordered on insanity. He said that humans did not fight wars the way other species did, because other species fought wars as contests of power, as displays of dominance, as tests of who was bigger and stronger and more numerous, and humans did not see war that way at all. Humans saw war as a problem to be solved. And they were very, very good at solving problems. General rose from his seat, and the chamber tensed because when an Ormka general stands, it usually means violence is about to happen. But Tharnok did not reach for a weapon. He instead walked around the table to where Jonah Mercer was now standing, having been quietly brought to the war chamber during the ceasefire negotiations. The massive Ormka towered over the human and looked down at him with eyes that had witnessed a fundamental shift in his understanding of the universe. And he asked Jonah a question that had been eating at him for 3 days. He asked how one small soft creature with no claws and no armor and no venom and a lifespan shorter than an Ormka childhood could do what he had done. Jonah looked up at the general, who stood twice his height and outweighed him by a factor of 10, and he answered with 5 words. He said, "You brought your strongest, and we brought our most stubborn." General stared at him for a long moment, and then did something that shocked every Ormka in the chamber. He placed his lower right hand over his chest in the Ormka salute of respect that was traditionally reserved only for enemies who had defeated an Ormka in single combat, and it was the highest honor a warrior of his species could bestow. Jonah nodded once in acknowledgement, and that was all. Later that evening, Director Akafar met privately with Archon Selûne in his personal chambers, and the ancient Therlian admitted that the Coalition had made a serious error in its assessment of humanity, and that this error would need to be corrected at every level of galactic governance. Director Akafar told him that humanity was accustomed to being underestimated, and that over the long course of their history they had learned not to resent it but to use it, because an enemy who underestimates you has already given you the greatest advantage in warfare, which is the element of surprise. Archon Selûne asked her if humanity had planned this from the beginning, if sending one soldier had been a deliberate strategy to reveal human capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. Director Akafar smiled and said she could neither confirm nor deny that. The Archon studied her face and realized with a mixture of admiration and deep unease that he had just received his answer. The following morning, the Galactic Coalition's official threat assessment database was updated for the first time in 11 years, and species classifications were adjusted, and military capability ratings were revised, and diplomatic priority levels were changed. And among the 42 member species, one entry was modified so dramatically that the intelligence analysts who processed the change formally requested confirmation from Archon Selûne's office because they were convinced it was an error. Humanity's classification had previously read Class 12, Negligible Threat and Minor Ally, a rating that placed them at the very bottom of the Coalition's hierarchy, alongside 3 other species that were considered militarily irrelevant. The new classification read, Class 1 Apex Threat, do not engage without overwhelming numerical and strategic superiority. And below that rating, someone, perhaps Archon Selûne himself, had added a handwritten note in the old Therlian script that translated to a single chilling addendum. It said that overwhelming superiority may not be sufficient. Somewhere on the rebuilt surface of Koreth, IV Sergeant Major Jonah Mercer sat on a rock outcropping, overlooking the smoking ruins of the Hive Fortress, and ate a ration bar, and watched the sunset through the clearing ash clouds. And he thought about home and about the small apartment he kept in a city called Austin, where a dog named Biscuit was waiting for him. And he thought about how the galaxy was very large and very strange and full of beings who measured power in size and teeth and ships, and yet had somehow never learned the oldest lesson that Earth had taught its children, that it is not the largest or the strongest or the most heavily armed that survives. It is the most adaptable. Jonah finished his ration bar and stood up and slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and walked toward the extraction point, where a shuttle was waiting to take him back to the fleet. He had work to do,